Okay, so we're going to begin tonight. Welcome everyone to the Northeast South Dakota AHEC and South Dakota EMS District 4 webinar. This month we are excited to have Wagner from Call to Freedom out of Sioux Falls talk to you guys a little bit about human trafficking awareness. Before we begin, we have a couple announcements. It's not too soon to start thinking about the EMS conference, which is the last weekend of October through the State EMS Association, and that will be in Sioux Falls. So you can check out their website for that. If you are ALS, please send your license number in the chat box and we'll make sure you get continuing ed credit for that. And then also if there's anyone watching with more than one people on one Zoom, make sure to put your guys' names all in the chat box as well. And we'll make sure everyone gets credit for that through the EMS portal and whatnot. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Wagner.
Awesome, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. Okay. Oh, that's not the right one. Gotta go backwards. All right. So can everybody see? I'm assuming everybody can see. If not, please let me know in the chat.
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Sounds good. So thank you. Yes, my name is Wagner Larsen Silva. I am the Community Navigator Coordinator with Call to Freedom in Sioux Falls. So we are a victim service provider in our state of South Dakota that provides services to victims and survivors of human trafficking and actually sexual exploitation as well. And so we kind of walk life with them. It's a lot of case management, intensive case management. But my role really with our organization is to be an educator within the community, make sure we're all on the same page, make sure that people understand what human trafficking is, what it looks like outside of the stereotypes out there and things like that. So I just really thank you for this opportunity to be able to speak on this and give you a little bit of information about what it looks like in our state. So some objectives, like I said, defining human trafficking, identify those industries in which human trafficking is happening, understand some of the vulnerabilities or often called risk factors that you might run into or things that you might see that make someone very vulnerable to that situation. I always think that in order to identify a human trafficking situation and help that person, you have to really understand some of those contextual pieces. So what's kind of happening behind the scenes, what they may be vulnerable to just based on the way that they were raised or the things going on in their lives that make them susceptible to that. Identifying those red flags. So some of those initial contact things that you can physically observe. And some of the behaviors that are often the first things that you observe with a trafficking situation or a trafficking victim. And then really talking about some of the services that we have at Call to Freedom, some of the partnerships that we have, and the people that are doing the work out there on that response side of things. So I always find it helpful before we start presentations to really start with survivor words. These are the individuals that have lived this life. We call it modern day slavery because this is something that is extremely manipulative, extremely hard for someone to battle. When they're in it, they don't necessarily know that they're in it. And so her words are very well put. And I think it's always just a good way to start. So amidst a struggle that she doesn't want to be in, one that was chosen on behalf of her, not because she could have chosen it, worn out from trying to win a battle that affects her reputation and one that's based off of his repetition, mistreated and degraded. She's unfit to handle what's happening around her. To say she must change would be making an unfair statement. People wish she would say something, report it, run away, scream for help and leave. But for her, there's a lot more complexity behind the simplicity. She can speak, but her words are better off unspoken. She's paused in a life that's moving on fast forward. There aren't many options in a mind like hers because her decision isn't based off of her. It's based off of his actions and the chances of making it through what might unfold thereafter. So with this individual, she had been through our program, is now actually doing very well, but she was trafficked at a very young age by her father and was groomed, was introduced to pornography at a very young age, drugs and alcohol as well, and eventually got her to that point where then she was being sold to other individuals. And so this is that was her life. She didn't know any different. She was used to abuse. She was that difficult kid in schools. She was there's a lot of behavioral issues there too. And so she was in trouble with the law all the time, just many different things that she was coming into contact with. But behind the scenes, all of this stuff was happening to her. She just didn't know how to cope with it. And so I think this is, again, very well put, beautifully written, and hopefully can shed some insight into what's happening in some of these situations. All right, so diving in here, human trafficking involves the use of force, fraud, or coercion to obtain some type of labor or commercial sex act. So we have three different pieces when we talk about human trafficking and what it needs to fit in order to actually make it a case. And that is the act means purpose. And so the act is what is done by the trafficker to get that person into that situation. So what is the intention? What are they actively trying to do, knowing that they're getting that person ready and prepared to be trafficked and sold? And so did they groom that person? Did they recruit them online, on a job portal, something like that? So those types of things, knowing that they actively went out and tried to do that. The means is how it's done. And so that is the force, fraud, or coercion, which we talk about a lot. This really is the method of control, which really makes this, it takes it from that exploitive behavior where it's not necessarily technically illegal to, yes, now this is definitely human trafficking. And so the method of control, it can look many different ways. The big myth is it looks like the movie Taken, or you think of the white van and people being kidnapped off the street and thrown in the white van and then forced into sex slavery, when in reality that can happen. But here in South Dakota, that is not typically what we see. That's not the main way that we know that it happens. A lot of individuals are tricked into these situations. They respond to ads online. They are, they have a relationship with somebody, and then that individual gets them to that point. And then that coercion piece too, which we will talk about these elements a little bit later as well, but coercion is more of that threatening behavior. So really attempting to scare that person so they can't leave that situation. That is really that method of control, or that means in this piece. And then the purpose is always commercial sex and labor services, and this is why it's done. So all of these different pieces of this model have to be met for it to be considered a human trafficking case. However, you will notice at the bottom there, it says force, fraud, or coercion is not required for minors induced into commercial sex acts under the age of 18. So basically what this means is that there is no such thing as child prostitution or a minor that's engaging in commercial sex. And when I say commercial sex, I mean there's a monetary exchange, or something of value is being exchanged for that sexual act. And so if a minor or a youth is going in willingly into a commercial sexual exploitation situation, they're still a victim in that situation. It's whoever's on the other end of that is buying, is the one that is actually the trafficker, or is the one in the wrong that would be criminally prosecuted under this human trafficking statute. So I hope that makes sense a little bit. I know it's kind of confusing, but it's really a gray crime. And, we had some survivors actually that came to our program this week. And one of the best things that she explained to me was human trafficking is very individualistic. There is not one perfect way to explain how human trafficking looks, because it can happen in so many different areas of someone's life. people can be manipulated in different ways, in different locations, with different methods. And so I think that just having that knowledge is extremely important. I'm gonna check the chat here. Okay, perfect. We'll keep going. I have a cheesy little video, but I think it's helpful to kind of understand that AMP model, to really break it down a little bit further and give you guys a little insight.
There's no sound coming out from our side, so I don't know.
Oh no.
So you might need to reshare and
Okay.
click the little sound box in the corner.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, let me just try this again. All right, share my screen. Share sound. Let's try this.
In a small sleepy
What about
town, people are dreaming. But not everyone's dreams will come true.
Thank you.
Human traffickers prey on people's dreams and lure them away for their own benefit. How do they do this? Human trafficking doesn't happen all of a sudden. It's a process. First, traffickers act. This includes recruiting victims, transporting them to the place where they'll be exploited, hiding them from authorities, and receiving victims from other traffickers. So why don't the victims run away or say no? Because traffickers use different means. This includes threatening or forcing victims to do what they want, abducting or deceiving the victims, and abusing power. Sometimes traffickers promise small payments or benefits to get the victim to cooperate. And why are the traffickers doing this? The purpose of trafficking is exploitation. Traffickers take advantage of victims for their own profit or benefit. This is human trafficking. This man's neighbor tells him that he has a great job for him on a very safe construction site and that he'll be paid a lot of money. With more money, he can make his dreams come true. He agrees to take the job. A few days later, the neighbor's friend picks him up and they drive to the construction site. It's a very long way from his home. This man is put to work immediately without any training or protective equipment, without enough to eat or drink, and with very few breaks. After many months, he's only been paid a fraction of what he was promised. He knows he's been tricked, but he doesn't have enough money to get home. This man is a victim of human trafficking. He was recruited by his neighbor and tricked into thinking he was going to work at a safe construction site for fair pay. Instead, he was forced to work long hours in unsafe conditions for almost no money, while others benefited from his exploitation. One day, while looking for jobs online, this woman comes across an opportunity to work in a restaurant in a big city. Her application is successful, and her new employer arranges for her travel there. She is met at the airport and driven to a part of the city that looks nothing like she expected. The car pulls up to a building. The door is shut and locked behind her. She is made to perform sex acts against her will. She is trapped. This woman is a victim of human trafficking. She was transported by a trafficker from the airport to the location of the job. When she arrived at the location and realized it was not the restaurant job she was expecting, the traffickers used force to keep her there. She was then exploited for forced sex work. This 14-year-old boy on school break is approached on the street by a woman who looks trustworthy. She tells him that she needs workers at her factory, and she promises him lots of money. He brings her to meet his parents. They are so happy for him. He'll now be able to save money for school. The woman drives him to the next town. They pull up to an old building. There is someone waiting for him. As he is led inside, the nice lady drives off. The factory isn't anything like she described. There are lots of people working, including many children. He works all day, and after just a few hours of sleep, he starts again. He is sad. This isn't what he expected. He misses his family. After weeks, he still hasn't received any salary or been allowed to contact them. He is trapped. This boy is a victim of human trafficking. He was tricked by the woman who recruited him on the street. He was then received by a trafficker when he arrived at the factory and exploited by being forced to sew clothing. For anyone under the age of 18, only the act and purpose matter for it to legally be a case of human trafficking. Understanding that human trafficking doesn't happen all at once, but instead is a process of act, means, and purpose, helps us better identify victims and trafficking trends. People everywhere are dreaming and looking for opportunities to make those dreams come true. Human trafficking is happening all around us. Will you recognize it when you see it? To learn more, visit iomx.org.
So like I said, kind of a cheesy little video, but it helps to put those pieces into perspective, because it can look different in everyday situation. It's not just like the movie Taken. It's not someone being kidnapped and forced into those sexually exploitive situations. It can happen many different ways, and oftentimes without that element of that initial kidnapping or that initial force. So I do want to touch on some of the industries in the areas of recruitment, especially here in South Dakota, with what we're seeing on our end with the survivors that we're serving. And so we'll start with that sex trafficking side of things. So the survival sex, this is a term that we use when individuals don't necessarily have some of those basic needs. And so individuals that are homeless, people that can't afford to pay rent, people that can't afford to buy groceries, things like that. So people will take advantage of those individuals and say that, you know, if you do this for me, I will take care of you. I will provide you the things that you need. I will give you a place to stay. And a lot of times this can often turn into drugs and alcohol as well. And so we're seeing this kind of a lot with the youth population, where the traffickers are building that relationship, recruiting them through drugs and the promise of a good time, to be honest. And so luring young people, getting them to that point where they're vulnerable now, and then taking advantage of them further. And so that oftentimes looks like that survival sex. Escort services, you know, what you think of often, that prostitution, it can happen here as well. A lot of times people will go into these situations willingly, thinking like, hey, this might be something that I'm good at. But if there is that third party or that force, fraud, or coercion involved, it turns into someone willingly doing it to being an exploitive trafficking situation. Bars and clubs, we know a lot of individuals are recruited out of these areas, again, where there is that vulnerability of people under the influence. It creates that potential for them to be trafficked. And so we have heard many of our survivors that have come through our doors that had been drugged, and a lot of times it will be at a party where they had friends that they trusted there, and they were drugged and they black out for multiple days at a time. And then when they come to, it's like, they're in pain. There's that sexual trauma that's present. And, you know, if they do remember things, it's that they were forced or were having continuous sex. So it can happen there, that area of recruitment. Stripping, pornography, same thing. It's already it can be sexually exploited. And so introducing, you know, more of that extra sexual activity into some of these industries, and then getting them to that point where they can maintain that control, is that trafficking. Hotels, motels, we know what happens in motels. That's one of the biggest places that buyers will meet. their victims and purchase the sex there. Online solicitation is huge. I think especially with all of the access that we have to each other online with social media, with all of these different apps, even with gaming now, it creates that world where people can easily have contact with us, and it creates that opportunity for individuals to build that relationship a lot easier, not really understanding that person's intentions, and then being vulnerable to being trafficked. So that's that sex trafficking side. There are many other ways that this can happen as well, but just some of the common ones that we're seeing. Labor trafficking is a little bit different. I will say that we are kind of just scratching the surface with some of the things that we're seeing with labor trafficking. We know that it is oftentimes a more hidden crime, human trafficking in general is, but it's really difficult with labor trafficking because some of the trends that we have become aware of with the individuals that we serve is a lot of this is happening with individuals that are being recruited from another country. And with the promise of, a great employment opportunity where they can, make some good money, send it back home to their families. And then when they get here, they are then told that they have to pay for, there's extreme conditions put into place. So they have to pay for their rent. They're constantly in debt to their trafficker, their employer. A lot of times they will take away their documentation. And so it creates that virtual, it's impossible for that individual to leave that situation, because if they're in a different country, or if they're in our country, they don't have access to some of their things and they try and leave, then it looks to people that they came here illegally. And so it creates just a whole dynamic of fear within that individual. And so some of the industries where this is happening, housekeeping, nannying, factories, and meatpacking plants, we have some big ones here in South Dakota. Agricultural work and farming. Obviously, we live in the Midwest, so there's a lot of farmland. And, another big barrier there is that if there are individuals that are brought to the country for that purpose, they oftentimes don't have a car. So even if they would want to try and get out of that situation, they would have to walk there. And if, some of these areas are very rural in the middle of nowhere. And so it creates that barrier to even getting those individuals help. Hospitality, food industries, and then manual labor and construction is another big one. So anywhere that there's a lot of recruitment, I would say contractual work is a big one, where companies will hire a large group of people and then get them to a job opportunity. I would say that's a big opportunity for individuals to be trafficked. So some other common things to know in South Dakota: event. So we have the Sturgis Bike Rally and pheasant hunting season. Those are two main events that we know that trafficking happens. Obviously, the bike rally, there's many people that flock to the west side of our state for the purpose of having a good time. We know that there's a lot of illegal activity that happens there, a lot of gang related culture as well. And within that, often there is that potential for trafficking. Same thing with pheasant hunting season. We know that, some of the big hunting lodges, some of the small towns have strip clubs that kind of become very, very popular in the midst of hunting season. And we have heard from some of our partners that it can also be a place where individuals are not just engaging in some of that stripping, but more of that commercial sex as well. So just something to think about. Organized gang is another way that it can happen. Oftentimes it's intertwined into the gang environment or the gang system. Familial is another way that I think people often look past, because it's a version of child sexual abuse. It can be, or domestic violence, sexual exploitation. But I think because it is often just defined as sexual abuse, we're not asking further questions to be able to know if there is that element of exchange on the other end of it. If there's monetary exchange, then it can often be a trafficking situation. So that is another way. And then online, like I said, it's just a way where people can be trapped into some of these online communities and exploited online as well, whether it's online pornography, things like that. So I touched on this a little bit, but breaking it down a little bit further, the means of control used by traffickers, that force. So this can look like rapes, beatings, confinement. So anything physically done to that person to keep them in this situation or keep them from leaving this situation. And oftentimes, that is when we think of that movie Taken. She was kidnapped, was forced into a commercial sex ring. But there's that fraud piece as well. So as I mentioned, that false and deceptive offer of employment, so recruiting from another country, it can also happen here within the United States. We've heard of a lot of individuals being responding to modeling ads online, or actually a modeling recruiter would reach out to them through social media, and they would do all these things, buy them all these things, get them to where they wanted them to go. This person thought it was a great opportunity. They liked the way that they looked. And in reality, they flipped that around and then were being held in that commercial sex situation. Marriage is another version of this that can happen. Like I mentioned with that familial, a lot of times traffickers can will marry their victims, and it becomes within that family dynamic, within that domestic violence dynamic, it's also they're being forced to have sex with other individuals, and with being tricked into a better life as well. So that coercion piece, it's a lot of the threats of serious harm to a person, the threats of the legal system, the threats of being deported, verbal and emotional abuse, and then brainwashing as well. I think the coercion piece is really difficult to try and prove in that court setting, just because traffickers are really tricky with how they manipulate and control their victims. And a lot of it is that brainwashing where they are kind of convincing them in a way that it's their fault, it's their issue. They're the ones that chose this lifestyle, even though many times it was because of the trafficker behind the scenes being very manipulative and abusive. So some of the vulnerabilities or those risk factors I do want to touch on. While anybody can be targeted or lured into that trafficking situation, there are some more common risk factors. So for example, we have a survivor that has been through our program, or I guess she's actually a great mentor for the rest of our clients now, because she's done a lot of work on herself and is in a really good place actually. But she didn't have a lot of these common risk factors that we see with some of our more vulnerable population. She lived in a pretty well-off family. She went to a Catholic school. She had, all of these seemingly things that went very right for her, but there was just one element where she just didn't feel like she belonged anywhere. And so she ran away and went to the East Coast and then got involved with trafficking there. But, when we look at some of these things, I think it's important to know that these can be things that make someone more susceptible. But anybody can really be susceptible if the trafficker identifies that vulnerability within that person. So to touch on some of them, unstable living situation, facing poverty, that's where a lot of that commercial or that survival sex will come in. Someone is being exploited. They have no other option. They need to do what they need to do to survive. History of abuse, sexual, physical, emotional, it creates that, a lot of times that broken down, some of those broken down boundaries. A lot of times there are relationship dynamics that were never really fully developed. And so it creates that vulnerability for an individual to be lured into something that is just as abusive. And so that is why that is another vulnerability. Addiction to substances, or grew up in a house with addiction. Addiction is one of the most prevalent things that we see with some of the victims coming out of these situations. And whether it is because that was, their initial reason why the trafficker went after them is because they were vulnerable to it, or a lot of times they are maybe not addicted, but eventually when they, after their trauma and all of these things happen to them, they do get that addiction just because of all of that they have to deal with. So history of running away from home or foster care. Our youth are extremely vulnerable. Has been incarcerated, involved in the juvenile justice system. Just another way, people can get to the point where they don't have a lot of options moving forward because of the criminal activity that they've been in. And much like the survivor story that I mentioned at the beginning, this was her. She was looked at as a bad kid. She was trying to live life, but now the opportunities were taken away from her because she was involved in all of these systems and pegged a certain way and labeled a certain way, I should say. LGBTQ plus community is another way that, this community can often be isolated, and individuals can be, there's not a lot of support from family or friends if there's that's just one of the ways that it can happen. So immigrants, people of color is another one, and then social media, dating apps. So some of the most common ones, as I mentioned, to being lured into these situations and really kind of getting them to that point where they can be trafficked. Okay, so I've done a lot of talking. Now I do want to read this case example to you, but I also want to have just you guys engage in some of this conversation. So I will read it, and then based on all of the things that I had talked about so far, if you guys want to point out some of the key pieces that are red flags to you in the chat box, and then we can kind of discuss. So Sarah had a difficult upbringing without a father figure in her life. She got in trouble when she got in trouble with drugs and alcohol in her teens and fell in love with an older man that bought her gifts, showered her with attention, and provided her with drugs she was using. Over time, Sarah's boyfriend started holding those gifts over her head and made her do things for him in order to pay him back for everything he'd done for her. This eventually included having sex with his friends. But because she had burned all bridges with her family and friends, she couldn't afford to leave him. She acquired many drug-related charges, which landed her in and out of jail. One night, Sarah was repeatedly raped by one of her boyfriend's friends as she was held in a hotel room. After hours of assault, Sarah was able to run to the nearest hospital for a sexual assault exam, but she wouldn't report who assaulted her. So this is a real life example of a survivor that we work with. Names have changed, but I just want to know what really stands out to you as far as some of the red flags initially that you see in this situation. Drugs and alcohol, absolutely. No father figure. So you guys are bringing up some of those vulnerabilities, which is awesome. Absolutely. Jail time. Yes, that is another reason it made her vulnerable. Older man. Absolutely. A big red flag there that she is in a relationship with an older man and buying her gifts. That is what we call that grooming behavior, where an individual or that trafficker will often build that relationship, take care of that person, treat them really well, and then all of a sudden there's a point where it switches and then they're being indebted to that person. Making her feel special, absolutely. Yeah, okay, so what, do you see those elements of force, fraud, or coercion? And if so, which ones? So that method of control. Give you a second. All three? Okay, perfect. She felt trapped, coercion. Yes. I would also say all three. Because when it comes to that force at the end here, when she tried to leave that, or she was locked in that hotel room, right? So she had no choice. She had to stay in that situation. Then there was more of that, I would say, that fraud piece when it comes to him promising her this beautiful relationship. A lot of times I think, when it's a too good to be true relationship, a lot of times there's that red flag right at the beginning. And that was the situation where he bought her all these gifts, showered her with attention, did all of these things for her. And then in reality, there's that coercion that comes into play because he's holding these gifts over her head. So absolutely, you guys got it. So picture perfect example of how all of this can happen. And those elements of force, fraud, coercion, and within that AMP model that we talked about. Now, I understand that some of these situations, you're not going to get all of this detail because, as emergency responders, you kind of just see what's happening in the forefront. But if you do have conversations with people, if you get to the point where you can ask them some of these questions, really asking, where those methods of control come in is kind of key. So we'll talk about some of the questions a little bit later. All right, so now we have a labor trafficking example too. So we'll do the same thing. I'll read it and we'll kind of break it apart a little bit. Jose, 15, was brought into the country without documentation by his father to work and support their family back in Guatemala. He worked for a restaurant where his father was a general manager. Jose was working 6 days a week for 12 hours per day, making only around $300 per week. The little money that Jose made, he sent home to his mother and siblings. One day, when Jose was 18, the restaurant owners accused Jose of stealing and assaulted him in the community. They threatened Jose that if he talked or left his job, they would call ICE and have him deported. After Jose reported the assault to law enforcement, more was revealed about Jose's unfit and harsh working and living conditions. Community support providers stepped in and helped provide safe housing, food, clothes, and access to legal support. An investigation took place by Homeland Security as well as Department of Labor, proving that hundreds of thousands of dollars were owed to Jose and other restaurant workers by the trafficker. So what do you see as the initial vulnerability in Jose's situation? Immigrant. Beautiful. Yes. Yes, he came into the country. What I know about this situation, he actually didn't necessarily know that the work he was doing was exploitive work until he kind of got to that point where he's just like, I can't do it anymore. He was being assaulted so many times. But initially he was like, I kind of just thought this is how work is in the United States. So he didn't know that there was that cultural barrier. So then going on to the method of control, there's the threatening family. Yes, absolutely. That force, fraud, or coercion piece. What other things do you see? There was that assault. He was assaulted in the community, which he never, yes, I would say all three as well, because probably tricked into coming into the country, being promised a certain job that he never actually got paid enough for. Yes, defamation of his character, stealing. Yes, they lied and said that he was stealing just as a reason to assault him. Absolutely. So there's that physical force that you see there. And then also that threat of being deported is the biggest one, I would say, because, and he even says that that in itself was the hardest thing for me, because he was taking care of his family back home. He was actually working with his dad or working for his father. And so, you know, it creates that really difficult dynamic where he, that in itself was one of the scariest things. Absolutely. Okay. So again, this is what it can look like with that labor trafficking side of things. How is his relationship? I'm getting a question in the chat. It says, how is his relationship with his father after this? So that's a great question. So Jose, so technically, if you look at the situation, his father was a trafficker or was one of the traffickers, and then the restaurant owners were the ones that kind of got his father to this point. So in my head, I know some people don't agree with me, but I almost think that the restaurant owners saw his father as being vulnerable and then got his dad into that point where he could manipulate his son into working these hours. To my knowledge, they don't speak anymore. But I also don't quite know. I'm not as involved in that situation. I just know that it actually went to court, but there wasn't enough evidence because they weren't able to corroborate victim stories to be able to make it a trafficking case. I think it was just more of that exploitation. So yes, that's a good question. Okay. Whoop. All right, so after that, before we start this video, yes, I do, you know, those are some of the picture perfect examples of how it can happen, what some of our survivor stories look like. A lot of times it involves drugs and alcohol, someone grooming them, giving them all of these things, and then having that debt bondage present as well. And we're gonna watch just a quick video just to give you a little bit of insight as to what's happening in South Dakota and why we're so vulnerable to it. Oh no.
There was evil in them and the kind of things that they were capable of doing. I was scared for my life. I had no idea that I was being trafficked while I was being trafficked.
Oftentimes people in the Dakotas think that we're immune from issues like human trafficking, that human trafficking is something that goes on in larger cities, but not here in the Dakotas. And that's not correct. But it's not sweatshops in Thailand or brothels in Bangkok. What we have in South Dakota is more what I would call homegrown. Anytime you have large gatherings of men, that creates the potential for problems. These young women find themselves in a very difficult position oftentimes. There's no question that there's prostitution that goes on during hunting season. When you have large gatherings of men, there is going to be a market there for this sort of human trafficking.
I think that we have to go way back in history. You know, the government coming in, taking up our land. I think that is the point at which we became more and more vulnerable.
Oftentimes in rural communities, including in Indian country, the individual that wants to purchase the sex will know the person who is offering up the young child for sex. Sometimes, sadly, what we see is bartering. So someone will say, look, I've got a niece and you can have sex with her in exchange for, a couple cases of beer.
It has to do with poverty. It has to do with alcoholism. Our families have broken down. And so I think all of that combined makes us very vulnerable.
Similar to the way, frankly, a pedophile would groom a potential victim. They will go out and recruit women to become part of these commercial sex trafficking rings. They'll make them all sorts of promises. And frankly, oftentimes be almost a father figure.
I was at a vulnerable point in my life, and that's one thing that these guys look for is vulnerability. They don't go after a woman that seems strong and seems like she's got everything together. I was going through a separation with the person I'd spent 10 years of my life with.
It will oftentimes start as, hey, why don't we earn a little extra money by doing this one time?
You numb yourself. The drugs that they'll give you, the things they'll do for you to make you think it isn't bad. Just because a woman seems like she likes it doesn't mean that she does. She's scared. It was the shame and then the fear, and I owed him money all of a sudden. He had me in a home I couldn't afford to pay for, a car payment I couldn't pay.
So you have an 18-year-old or a 17-year-old girl, she wants out. The pimp will say things like, well, look, I also know you have a 12-year-old sister. You're going to continue to do what you're doing.
If I ever didn't do what he wanted me to do, he was going to hurt my children.
We've seen savage beatings. We've seen rapes. Even if initially they went willingly, if at some point they were the victim of threats, fraud, or coercion to keep them in that situation, then we have a prosecutable federal offense. Here's the challenge. The federal law enforcement in South Dakota, we don't have a lot of manpower. So what we are really dependent upon in those types of cases are faith-based organizations, domestic violence shelters, folks who are oftentimes the first responders.
It's an amazing feeling just to know that they're not going to hurt other women the way that they hurt me.
What we want the perpetrators of these crimes to know is that we're going to be behind every corner. If you're engaged in this sort of behavior in South Dakota, we're going to get you. And when we get you, we're going to put you away for a long, long time.
Okay. So again, he mentioned the events in South Dakota, and then you also heard from a survivor and her story. And, a lot of those elements that we just talked about with that grooming and, kind of trapping them in these situations where they have really no other option but to engage in this behavior. So I do want to touch on some of the red flags and the indicators that, will be present in many of these situations. However, all of these can be present, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a trafficking situation. You really just have to understand the context, understand what's happening behind the scenes to be able to identify it. But if you notice some of these things, it could be a red flag. So general indicators: scripting or inconsistent history. We see a lot of this when it comes to coming into the emergency room. These individuals are with a very controlling individual that is not letting that person speak to the doctor or even the person at the front desk that's checking them in. It's that very controlling environment where that something's maybe not quite right. And the person, when they do speak, if they do, it's like they're being coached on what to say. It sounds very scripted, or maybe their story doesn't line up. That is one of the huge red flags that we see within the medical setting. Evidence of controlling, dominating, as I mentioned, fearful or nervous behavior, avoiding eye contact, not aware of his or her location, current date or time. I think this might be one of the biggest ones for you guys. Not being aware, especially when it comes to the transit type of trafficking. people that are in these situations that are being transported from place to place, they maybe not know where they're at. And a lot of times, it's just such a common occurrence to them that it's, that's not something that is they worry about or they care about. And so if we're asking them that question, do you know where you are? Those types of things, that is a huge red flag. Obviously, if there's not like head trauma or things like that, that it could be human trafficking. Not in possession of identification documents or money, another big thing. That is where that control element comes in. A lot of times traffickers, boyfriends, girlfriends in those situations will take their documentation. It's really hard to do anything, apply for a job, get housing, anything like that if you don't have an ID or a birth certificate. Tattoos indicating ownership is another one. So, you'll see things like daddy or dollar signs, things like that. We don't see as much of this anymore with some of the individuals that we serve, but it can still happen, especially within that gang type environment where they are part of the gang and there's that ownership within the gang of that person. Can be a red flag. Reports high number of sexual partners. History of sex work, obviously, if that comes up, they're under the age engaging in commercial sex work. That is oftentimes a red flag that trafficking is happening. Consistent debt to their employer. So some of the general indicators, some of the physical indicators, they appear very malnourished. They have, obvious history of multiple sexual assaults, STIs, pregnancies. They have bruises in different phases of healing. A lot of burns. Burns are kind of big within the clientele that we serve. TBI with assaults or abuse. Substance use disorders, that is very common. Somatic complaints. One of our survivor mentors goes, she oftentimes talks about, when I go into the emergency room, or when I used to go into the emergency room, I would always say, like, I have a stomach ache. And she kind of was pegged as a med seeker because they did test after test and nothing was wrong. And, with the trauma that she experienced, that was very real pain to her. And, it's often that complaint of, there's just something always wrong, or I feel like something's wrong. Unexplained memory loss, evidence of strangulation, another big one. So some of the behavioral health indicators I think are extremely important to watch for. They may appear hostile and distrustful. They have been often taught that authority figures are bad and don't want to help them, and sometimes they will be arrested because they're engaging in either possession of drugs, under the influence, anything like that. A lot of times they're already being arrested, and so they're often conditioned that they are the bad people in those situations, so they're distrustful. Dissociation or feelings of not being in the body, memory loss, physical and emotional numbness. They're suicidal, PTSD, anxiety, depression, some of those main ones. Those feelings of shame and guilt, has difficulty establishing and maintaining relationships, and then constantly engaging in some of those high-risk behaviors. So some of the general red flags in those three different categories to look out for, keep an eye out for in the work that you do. Some of the questions that you can ask if you do see some of those red flags. So that's kind of what we would recommend. We don't expect you to be an expert in human trafficking by any means, but if you see some of those red flags, now knowing a little bit more, ask a question or two, even if it's something very small, like, are you safe? Do you want out of the situation that you're in? And if they say yes to that, then, figure out people in the community that can help with further assessment within that situation to refer them on to further services. And so here are some example questions. Has anyone threatened to hurt you or your family if you refuse to do what they asked? Does someone else control access to transportation or not allow you to come and go as you please? Is someone else in control of your personal identification or other documents? And then, are you not permitted to use a phone or other communication devices, restricted or isolated from family or friends? So again, this will help you identify that element of control in their situation. And if that is present, then you can always refer on to individuals that can further investigate. So I think it's also important to know that many people in these situations do not self-identify. And so when it comes to us kind of expecting them to call out for help if they need it, that is rarely ever going to happen. And so some of the barriers is obviously they feel shame and guilt. They don't know that they're being victimized. They have been brainwashed. They have been coerced. They are so broken down a lot of times that they just, they don't necessarily know that that's the thing that's happening to them. And they're a victim of that situation. Lacks understanding about their rights, lacks identification. There's that language barrier is another huge one. And then that very real fear of whether it's deportation or harm to their family members, or being arrested as well. Trauma bonding is something that we talk about a lot. This is when an individual truly loves the person that is abusing them, or that Stockholm syndrome. And that also prevents people from leaving. Even though that this person is doing very horrific things to them, they still have that attachment to that individual because they're providing for them. There's this constant cycle of abuse, and then a lot of times it'll be like that honeymoon phase where they are then, oh, I'm so sorry I did this to you. So that often can be how they manipulate that trauma bond. Feelings of hopelessness and helplessness, and then that distrust of the provider or authority figure. Some things to know while maybe coming into contact with some of these situations, people won't necessarily identify. Sometimes it's up to us to prompt a question or two to be able to see if they need help in those situations. So some of the key focuses of whoever the person responding on that initial contact is, the main thing, if you do want to come into contact with that person and you have those suspicions, they need to feel safe. They need to feel physically safe, away from their trafficker, and they need to feel emotionally safe as well. So if you are asking questions in front of the person that you suspect to be abusing them, they're not going to cooperate. So, creating that safe environment and letting them kind of take charge, and we'll actually talk about that in the next slide, but helping them to feel safe in that situation. Basic needs is another big one. A lot of times the trafficker will manipulate those basic needs. So for example, on that video that we just watched, that boyfriend said, you owe me all of this stuff. Now you can take care of it. And that was just a basic need that she had, just to someplace to stay. And he controlled that and said that, oh, you can pay for it if you go and engage in this behavior. Right. And so having, just some like waters on hand and giving them some of those, something to eat, something like that. And that will help to kind of build that rapport and help them feel safe and able to feel like they can come forward. And that validation is a big piece too. A lot of times, and especially victims of human trafficking, when they tell their stories or when they say something that has happened to them, a lot of times they're testing you. They will test to see if you are going to react. And if you react, they know if you're a safe person or you're not. And so a lot of that validation where I believe you, I'm so sorry that this happened, and letting them take the lead and just, helping with that validation process is very important in that situation. And so we like to encourage that trauma-informed response. So you've identified it's a trafficking situation, now what? So there are two different approaches to this when it comes to response. So if it's a child or youth that is being trafficked, you have to go through those mandatory reporting protocols. And so, CPS needs to be involved, and then law enforcement as well. What we do know is that if it's a CPS case, they're the ones that take on more of those familial or guardian types of trafficking, and then law enforcement will often take the ones that are outside of the family unit, so the older boyfriends, girlfriends, within that gang related things like that. But when it comes to a youth, we always recommend cross-reporting. So always calling CPS and always calling law enforcement and making that report there, and then letting them kind of take charge of what happens next in that situation. Because if you've identified, you have that suspicion, all you can do in that situation is make that report, and then they take it from there. So if it's an adult, however, the process looks a little bit different. You see the signs, obviously, and then asking those questions, as I said, are you safe? Do you want out of that situation? And if so, then great. Maybe you can help them get to either a shelter, or at least provide them information about some of the resources that are available in your community, because every community is different and some of those victim services look a little bit different. So it's really starting that conversation, letting them know that there is something out there for this, and helping to connect them with that resource. So what services do we offer at Call to Freedom? I'll start by saying we do work across the state. We have a case manager. We're actually hiring for a new position that is going to be able to travel. We're still in Sioux Falls, but they will be able to travel to across the state to be able to provide case management services to individuals that need it in some of our rural areas. And so with that, what our services really focus on is that outreach case management. And so providing, really connection to resources, assessment of what that person needs, figuring out what is holding them back in their life, whether it is, that immediate safety that they need. So we do a lot of connecting with the domestic violence shelters across our state, our homeless shelters, getting them a place to stay, and then really figuring out from there what is going to help make them successful in, one, staying away from the trafficking situation, and two, to be able to thrive in their lives. And so it really looks different for every person. And our outreach case managers are going out into the communities and meeting the people where they're at. Versus Housing Project is another portion of Call to Freedom. We offer, it's supportive housing. And so it's not emergency shelter, and it's not transitional housing, but it's kind of in the middle there, where we do have some programming. They have to follow certain rules. It's not a halfway house, but it's a safe place where they can go and often learn some skills, work with our staff to be able to transition back out into the community successfully. Employment and housing assistance, these are two of the main barriers for survivors after they come out of this situation to being successful, is they can't find work. So they'll often go right back into their situation because they know they can make money there, or they can't find housing as well, because a lot of times in these situations they have felonies on their record, and so then they can't apply for certain housing, which makes it very difficult. And so we have advocates in these areas to help bridge some of those gaps, whether it's connecting with different employers, and also connecting with different housing, whether it's private landlords or some of the housing systems in our state. We have occupational therapy as well to help, with many different things that often are a result of the trauma that an individual has experienced. So if they have trouble coping, they can't regulate emotions very well, we have occupational therapists that can come alongside and help them with some of that. They also help with time management and cooking things, and just some of those basic things that a lot of times these individuals lack because of the situation that they're in. And so helping them really kind of gain some of those basic skills back. Youth services, we have a youth case management or youth case manager, and then we also have a youth navigator. These individuals will go into the community. Our youth navigator will provide prevention curriculum or education to youth in schools, in treatment centers, in just any different youth programs across our state that is really focused on giving them education on how to prevent themselves from being a victim of trafficking. So not really talking about trafficking all that much, but talking about the precursors. So how do you stay safe on social media? What does consent look like? What does a healthy relationship look like in your age group? And so really kind of having those discussions surrounding that. And then again, our case manager is often a part of that as well. And so if anybody does identify, we are able to help navigate through what that looks like. Training and technical assistance, and then also our survivor and mentorship program that our main survivor will help take other individuals that are just coming out of this situation under her wing and really help them process through what has happened to them and help guide them in the right direction. So if you want to contact us, do you have referrals? Here is our information. This 759-3565, that is our main referral number that she can kind of talk through the situation and help if you suspect something. You can call either of us. Actually, my navigator number is down here as well. If you suspect something you don't quite know for sure, you can always call us and ask. And if you have a referral or you know for sure, or you want to connect somebody with us, I would call that top number. And that is the best way to do that. Other resources, to make a report, we oftentimes utilize Department of Homeland Security, and we recommend reaching out to them directly to make that report. They, from the cases that we've worked with them, they are kind of taken a lot of the lead in some of the human trafficking cases. And so reaching out directly to them and reporting any suspicions that you have is what we would recommend. CPS, the report number is there. I know in the Aberdeen area, and I know that's kind of, you guys are kind of everywhere, but Aberdeen area, they have Safe Harbor, which is an awesome shelter. And I know they provide other outreach assistance as well for victims of, domestic violence, sexual assault, and I believe human trafficking as well. And then Call to Freedom number as well. And then Sanford Child's Voice. This is our child advocacy center on the east side of our state, and they will do more of that forensic medical evaluation if those cases go through CPS and law enforcement. So just some resources for you if you have any questions or for us, or if you want to make a report. All right. That concludes my presentation. Does anybody have questions? I do want to open it up if anybody has any questions.
And you are able to unmute yourself if you want to ask.
No one? Okay. Oh, I see a chat. Thank you. You're welcome. You can always reach out to me if you have questions, want to talk through something, that's great too. Usually when we do these presentations, people will go back and think, I worked with somebody, or I saw somebody in the community, I thought something didn't look right. And so we can always help process through some of that too. All right.
It looks like we have a question in the
We
chat.
do have a question. What do we do in the situation where female sex trafficked and her trafficker won't let them talk and want to ride along with us it is she in with us, is she injured?
Probably if she's injured.
If she's injured. Okay, sorry. Okay, so what do we do in a situation where female sex trafficked and her trafficker won't let them talk and want to ride along with us if she is injured? So you can, this is really hard. If the victim is in the presence of the trafficker and you have that suspicion, if you can separate them, that is awesome. A lot of times we will, when it comes to like emergency rooms and things, we'll try and help work with that department on creating a policy or a protocol where if they have those suspicions, they can, make something up like, we need to bring this person back and and only they can come with me, right? And so like if they need to do a UA and you can't come back in that room with them. So that's an example of what that looks like in like the emergency room. I don't know what that would look like. And sometimes if you're trying to force them apart, that will often be more dangerous for that victim in that situation. So I guess I don't quite know, to be honest. I don't know how to answer that question. If anybody else has insight on that, claim your ambulance policy won't allow passengers other than patient. There you go. Perfect. So that would be your example of, like in the emergency room, how to separate that person. Perfect. And utilizing law enforcement. Awesome. That's a good question though. Each service has a policy. They do vary. Sometimes common sense must prevail, especially if you sense a threat. And that's what I say too. We always recommend, it's okay to lie in these situations if you don't have necessarily a policy set up, but that this person is in danger. Lie and say like, hey, this is how it works. You can't come back here, or something like that. It's, you're looking at the safety of that person that you're assisting or you're wanting to assist. Not a lie. Okay. Any other questions? All right. Thank you all for listening, being on. Thank you for your time. It's been fun. Okay, I will stop sharing my screen now.
And we are done. So thank you everyone. And thank you, Wagner, for coming on and talking. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you.